happy to have you here. My name is Tracy Lee. I lead Venture Development for Entrepreneurship and Innovation here at ASU. And we have a wonderful panel in store for you. I know many of you for this career fair. This is really a dynamic and wonderful opportunity for you to get insight. Many of you obviously here have interest in maybe working for a startup, right? How many of you want to work for a startup? Or like, I just want to find out more about that. How many of you want to be a founder in a startup? How many of you have been founders in startups? All right, a number of you, all right. It's a different dynamic and it's a different world. And some of our panelists were just discussing some of the shifts that we've seen over the years on how we look at startups, what is that world like? And one of them commented that it used to be really kind of not as transparent, and it's starting to be more transparent. There's starting to be kind of more organization around the world of working in a startup. And so there's really a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of different types of ways that you can go about being in a startup. And so this panel is going to start going through some of the key components that you should be aware of on, what questions to ask. What is that world really, really like? So first of all, I want Zach, who is my co-moderator for this panel, to introduce himself, and then I will introduce our panelists and we will get underway.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zachary Holman, and I'm a professor here at ASU in electrical engineering. Most of my research is about solar energy and the materials used to make solar cells. And I'm also the co-founder of SwiftCoat, which is a coatings company. And the first product of that company is a self-cleaning window for homes. And they're on the other side of the wall over there, so you can come and talk to us afterwards. And I'm very happy to join you in learning from the expert panel that we have here about what it's like to work at a startup company.
All right, so we have a mic. We have one mic. There, my mic is working again. All right. We might be in business here. Okay, so going to introduce our panel, and we selected this panel for a number of different reasons based on the roles that they play within the startup environment, the expertise that they can share with you, and multiple different levels, from just getting started, being that for one of those first people on board, to the startup is really gaining some traction. So we wanted to be able to provide you some really unique perspectives from our panelists. So in no particular order, we're going to get started. Katie Holman O'Neill. You can raise your hand over there. She started her career in hospitality, has worked in San Francisco startups since 2012, and can give you, I'm sure, a very interesting perspective on what it's like in that region of the world. Her startup, if only, recently was acquired by MasterCard. It's an online marketplace for experiences, WeFunder, platform for crowdfunding, and Forward, which is a health tech company aiming to revolutionize healthcare. She's worn many hats, which is traditional in the startup realm, but primarily specialized in operations and customer experience. She attended Cornell University's School of Hotel Administration. So welcome to Katie. Cole Shelton, he's VP of Product at Oral Analytics. Oral Analytics detects signs of neurological disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and stroke from short speech tasks patients complete on their devices. Prior to Oral Analytics, Cole was the first product management hire at Magic Leap, where he led on a portfolio of hardware and software projects to help the company launch its augmented reality headset and OS. He was also founder of a SaaS startup for physical therapists called Digital Athletics, project manager at Sagencia, helping develop new devices for consumer and medical clients. Cole has an MBA from Harvard and a BSc in biomedical engineering from Duke. So welcome to Cole. Arno is our next panelist. Arno Merkel has 10 plus years of management experience in 3 startup environments within scientific instrumentation fields. That includes 2 successful acquisition exit scenarios. Currently, he is the director of business development for Tescan, a European company specializing in electron microscopy and X-ray imaging. Additionally, he guides business efforts at Crystal Sonic. That's an early stage startup out of ASU, one of our programs, Venture Devils. They're one of our ventures in the program. Previously, he held positions in product management and marketing for XRE, Exradia, and I'm mispronouncing some of these, and Carl Zeiss. Arno has a PhD in materials science from Northwestern University and an undergrad degree in physics from Gustavus Adolphus College. His professional interests and skills include product and segment marketing, as well as business development, with a focus on translating technologies into release products that are best matched to key market opportunities. And last but not least, Ryan Kemet is a consultant to startups and global organizations. He's the former Director of Global Innovation and Business Development for Linamar Corporation, a global automotive Tier 1 OEM. Prior to that, Ryan was a Senior Product Engineer at Advanced Green Innovations, a green energy startup. He's also a graduate of U of A, which we won't hold against him today, with a degree in materials science and engineering and Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. So please welcome our panelists for today's discussion. So we're excited to have you all on board today. All right, so getting started, I'm going to ask all of you, and how this is going to run is that we want to really kind of set the table on really the world of startups and what that looks like, and then we're going to ask some specific questions related to each of our panelists, and then we also have questions that you all have submitted that are really outstanding that we will address as well. So let's get started. So first of all, tell us about the companies you've worked at. How big was each? How early a hire were you? And what was your role specifically?
Testing. So I've done, I think, 3 startups at this point. Most of them in software or software plus hardware. And so I joined a SaaS analytics startup. And I was there from about 30 to 100. So I can kind of talk about that early phase. I ran my own on the side, a small kind of modest startup. And then joined a much larger effort, Magic Leap, where we had raised $2.3 billion to make this thing happen. And so there I joined at about 450 and was there all the way to about 1,300. And that was a much grander effort. And so we can talk about that if it helps. And then finally at Arl, we are up to about 12 now. And that is a digital health startup. So happy to talk about kind of that range of experiences.
Excellent. So my experience, I've been with 3.5 startups. I can explain why the half. I guess my first job out of grad school was actually with a smaller division of a large international hardware company. So all of my experience has been in like hardware, so scientific instrumentation, characterization. And so that was a smaller division of a large, like 25,000 employee company. And that was immediately after a startup acquisition, so I kind of saw it from the employer, from the larger company side. I then moved on to a company out in the Bay Area of San Francisco, about a 50, 60 person startup at that time, kind of 10 years in, kind of a quick ramp up stage, also in hardware, joined product management for that. And so I've sequentially been going smaller and smaller throughout my career. The third group, I then joined an 8 or 9 person startup based in Europe, out of Belgium, in the same field. Was doing business development for that, so I really got a sense for, let's say, the excitement and chaos of that kind of environment of less than 10 people. And now, most recently, I'm heavily involved with the group here at Crystal Sonic, which is even smaller, just getting off the ground here at ASU, really setting our path forward. So really just a couple of people. So I have kind of a range of different experiences.
Is that the half?
Oh, the half was the first one because it wasn't really a startup. It was like a year after I was involved with the startup that had just gotten acquired. And so I saw the kind of the integration efforts. So that was the half, maybe 0.1.
Hi. So the first startup I worked in, I was probably number 10, and we grew to about 65 people over about 4.5 years. That's the company that was acquired pretty recently. I joined to lead, I wore a lot of hats. I would say I was probably customer support, customer service, logistics. I was a QA engineer for a minute. We were all kind of QA engineers. I did sales. I did account management. I launched a new category. So it's sort of all the stuff. And then as we grew, I was able to shed some of those hats. I then worked for a company called WeFunder, which is a crowdfunding startup. And I was head of operations there, and we were 10 people, grew to about 18, shrank back down, grew again. So that was kind of an interesting experience in a variety of ways. And the company I'm at now is a health tech company, and we are probably somewhere between 100 and 150 in HQ with some offsite teams as well. And I am working in operations, managing an offsite, like a remote workforce of 100 plus people. So pretty diverse experiences.
That's great. My experiences have been from small person, I was about the 20th person at AGI, and it grew to about 150. And then I think it's dropped down to about 50 now. It's still going. Following that, at Linamar, we were as part of an in-house, essentially a VC group, so we were acquiring and partnering with startups. But Linamar is about 35,000 people in a global company. So it's a wide variety there. Let's hear.
So I'd like to ask the next question. I was intrigued here. Arno, you're apparently going to smaller startup companies, and Ryan, you've gone in the other direction, the get me out of the 20-person startup, let me go to the large company. So I just want to ask, what was it for you two in particular that made you think, okay, startup, small, large, and not large corporation, or yes, large corporation? Is it the freedom, the chaos that you love, the promise of getting rich upon IPO? What were you thinking? What was the motivation?
So part of it was by accident, but I think in my case, going from large to small, what I appreciated about it, and you're in a large company, you do kind of get lost. You're in your little division, but everything around you is done reasonably well and professionally, and so you see a lot of aspects of the business, but you don't really understand them at that point. And I think what drove me also to go smaller and smaller was the opportunity to kind of expand my understanding of the business mechanics and operations of, whether it's marketing or business development or manufacturing, you name it, any function of R&D, any function of the company, kind of to be more involved with more aspects of it. I saw that as intriguing. I never studied business in college or graduate school. I come from a technical background, and so kind of I fit into a technical position initially. And for me, it was kind of going to a smaller and smaller company was more of just an educational experience, right? You get involved with more and more on the business and financial side of things as well. And so personally for me, I got more out of learning more about expanding the scope of what I was doing. And having more control, and I was also personally, I'm not particularly risk adverse, so taking a step to a smaller company obviously comes with risks, and at least at that stage in my career, I was willing to do that, and happy I did it. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I wasn't necessarily just driven by the large company side. It was that being at a startup for several years, especially in kind of hard technology, it's hard to have the resources and capability to actually execute on whatever the product is. Just it's unbelievably difficult to do that. One of the things that drew me to a large organization at the time was that knowing that the engineering process would be followed and the resources would be there if we had an initiative to go through. So if we acquired a startup, I knew that we would take whatever their technology was and actually go execute. We would get a major OEM that would make a purchase order, and that'd be a pretty binding contract at that point. So it was more about getting to actually see the technologies to real marketplace compared to when I was at a startup, and it was a maybe, hopefully, at one point in time. So it was more about getting to know for sure that these things would be taken to market.
So with that, Katie, we're going to move over to you. You talked about a couple of things with your experience you were with a startup that had X amount of employees, and then it went up, and then it dropped back down. And both of you had just talked about a little bit of the adversity and some of the risk that comes along with that. So talk through us about what that experience is like, and what kind of skill sets really help equip you not only to wear the multiple hats in a smaller environment like that, but how do you handle that uncertainty of things could start kind of starting and stopping and starting and stopping, and how do you handle that, and what skill sets are particularly applicable for that type of environment?
Sure. I think scrappiness in general is incredibly valuable in a startup environment, and being adaptable and being comfortable with the level of ambiguity the only change is constant. It just is the way it is. It's obviously not delightful to, shrink your already small startup, particularly because of money and not having runway. But I think that in the same way, I used to run restaurants, and in a time like in 2008 when everything was not pretty, I really felt that we had a huge opportunity. If we could be super tight on what we were doing, we were going to thrive in that period of time. And so I think it actually kind of forced a sense of we have to be on it, we have to be focused, we have to be crisp. And so people who are adaptable to that in a and maybe like there is a sense of not being super risk averse. I actually found it a really interesting time because I hadn't seen a company, do this. I hadn't been there for that, and so I actually kind of felt fortunate to have the experience, and felt like I could. I'm lucky enough that I share financial responsibilities with my partner, and so I felt that I was able to be in a position to like watch it and be part of it, but it wasn't freaking me out terrifically. But I think that being able to be scrappy, and the thing that I really tried to bring to the table in that point was our CEO was not a stellar communicator, and the team wasn't necessarily getting the transparency and the communication that they needed that would allow them to feel not freaked out. And so I tried to take on that role, and I think that the communication piece is what enabled us to move through it. And there's obviously a lot to be done in terms of, hey, what are we spending money on that's not necessary? Like, let's go after that. Let's target a list of things that are going to allow us to be as tight as possible, which will help us, get back to a place where we can grow again. But I really tried to bring to the table the piece around communication and making sure that people felt safe-ish, in terms of knowing what to expect next. It was really interesting, but I'm not there anymore.
I can add to that. I'm glad you brought up communication. That's a big part of it. I think what I found in my career, like no matter what technical skills you've learned or brought in, is like even in a business environment, whether it's large or small, your ability to get across what you're trying to say and thinking, that those skills or those soft skills really are important. I think coming back to like kind of scary scenarios. My first job I took, it was midway through 2008, and it was in the midst of the financial crisis. I don't know how I got the job, but I think I came in as a contractor. And at that point, I really just focused on, I think the whole company was going through some scary times. It was a larger company, but really just focusing on the basics, and also having, at least we had some good management within the company that helped get me through. But I was brand new. I had no idea what I was doing. So I think that settled itself. I would say in terms of navigating the waters, like in a smaller startup environment, and like the skills that you need, I found, like, I draw on my experience with my colleagues in Belgium at the small, less than 10-person startup company that I joined, and that there you have to really fall back on there were some business practices I learned at the medium stage startup that really helped, and that's really spending the effort and the time to really understand your market, understand your customers, and refresh that constantly, and go through that like strategic planning process and be open with everybody in the company. And that really focuses everybody on where we're going, what options we have. Otherwise, things can spiral out of control, and everybody has different opinions, and you don't know which way you're going. And so falling back on those processes really helps, I think.
You guys may have read articles about how startups are very up and down, right? I think what some of them miss is just the absurd degree to which that is true. So I can think back a couple startups ago where literally between 2 days, in the span of 48 hours, went home one night and I was physically uncomfortable with how much money we were about to make. Like, oh my God, we're about to explode. The very next day, I went home, we are so clearly going to fail. So within the course of 48 hours, some reasonable people had those two feelings, right? So it's when you read about that, take that severity to heart. The thing that I think helps with it, though, is just a little bit of knowledge about what is normal, and that is actually kind of normal. If you just go back, pick a couple of your favorite startups. Airbnb is a really classic one. Go read the Airbnb story. They didn't start anywhere near Airbnb. And so the place that you land a year in or 2 years in is just so different from the starting point that if you're going through it and stuff is changing so much, what's going on, reminding yourself that is actually just part of the process can help with some of the anxiety and the learnings.
So you all have got me a little bit scared now here with this talk of risk and things changing. And so I'm going to ask each of you, and I want to start on that side, so the microphone ends back here, why you do it, and maybe I'll rephrase that differently and ask, what is it that you most love about working at a startup company, or have loved, and in many cases has brought several of you back to startup companies multiple times? Sounds like an addiction.
the actual creating something new. Like that's actually what's always drawn me into it, that it's something that is like, not to be, too crazy, but it's, oh, this is going to change the world in some way, shape, or form, that I don't think that oftentimes without a startup, that concept or idea, I can't really embrace that almost anywhere else other than within a small company who has a new idea and has the vision to just go for it. That's the part that's really always brought me back to wanting to work with small companies and new ideas.
I think for me it's twofold, and one is a bit reactive or turning away from something else. So I started my career in hospitality, and I worked for very high-end restaurants. And generally in restaurants, it's not really okay to mess up, even though it's just dinner, probably. It must all be operating at this very high-pitched, sort of fast, service-driven pace. And I enjoy that, but there's also, no one's going to do everything perfectly the first time all the time. And I think in startups, there's an understanding of that. And I really appreciated that. It was really refreshing to me when I joined my first startup, because the understanding is more, here's a problem. What do we think the best way is to attack it based on, various inputs, probably data-driven? Cool, let's go after that. If it doesn't work, let's figure that out quickly, learn from it, and move on. And that feels really reasonable. So I think that's something that I really enjoyed. The other thing is that at the 3 startups I've worked at, the people have been phenomenal. I think it's really fun to do something with a tight-knit group of people who are all driving in the same direction and passionate about something, and probably had some of the Kool-Aid. Hopefully had some of the Kool-Aid. And I have made some of the best friends that I have. I met my husband at the first company I worked at. I'm close with these people, and we've gone through hard stuff before together. And we've also gone through really amazing things where we made something out of nothing. And to me, that's stellar.
Katie, I'm glad you mentioned that camaraderie, that's a big part of it. I mean, you find like-minded people, or not necessarily, there's a lot of conflict often in small startups, but it really turns into a family environment often. I think the degree of the sense of control of your destiny that you have is one thing that's attractive. Also the ability to create something completely new that hasn't been done before, and solve and enable different problems that nobody's done before. I think that's certainly attractive. I mean, most of my career has been in product management and marketing, and so really defining products and finding out ways. Really, I've been in kind of this scientific area before, so I've had the fortune and opportunity to see cutting edge research all over the world and explore with different customers and clients what they're working on, what their issues are, what they're trying to do, and then coming up with a technology or product to service their desires. I think that's been really exciting. But in the end, I think it comes down to that sense of spirit and working with really energized, motivated people. In the end, that's what it comes down to, and that's what I enjoy a lot. And that's where you see the most density of that kind of environment is definitely in a startup.
So I've always come at it from product roles as well. And there's just a particular flavor of the problem in the early days of a startup where you don't know what the product is and you don't know who the customer is, right? It's the whole search for product market fit is this co-optimization of maybe we could do that, but maybe people would want it, but maybe we tweak it a little bit more and then something else happens. And it's just at that point where you have one designer, an engineer, one product manager, and you're just figuring it out. That kind of exploration for me is the most fun. You can get a little bit of that in a kind of a corporate innovation role. It's just one of those things tends to be assumed. Either we know who the customer is, let's build some more stuff for them, or we have this awesome technology, who will go buy it. But to really just focus on the problem and build all the things around it is a little unique to a startup. With the moving target specifically, she mentioned, yes.
And Cole, you bring up some interesting points about how that terrain is pretty murky in the beginning. And so when we talk about kind of the risk associated with startups, let's go to the other side of that. You talked about what you love about working with startups, but we have a room full of folks that have interest in maybe working for a startup. So what are the things to avoid? What are some of the pitfalls? What are the red flags if they're talking with a startup to work for them? And what kind of expectations should they have? And what kind of questions should they ask to really uncover whether it's the best opportunity for them?
Oh boy, okay, so that was a lot. Let's pick, maybe I'll start with the first part of that. So we have some folks, if you wouldn't mind, raise your hand if you're looking for an internship. Okay, and then raise your hand if you're looking for full-time. Okay, so I think so things to look for, things to keep in mind, that kind of jazz. There's a pretty clear distinction between a Series Seed and A-ish startup and then a B sort of in the middle, but a CD. A Series C, D, these are the hyper-growth, interesting startups that you've heard of that have money, and going there will look very different than going to a younger seed and A. Lots of people recommend you go to a Series Seed and D because they have a little bit of institution, right? They have a little bit of infrastructure, and in particular, they have a mentor for you to learn from. That tends to be, I think when you're looking for especially an internship, but also that first gig, you are looking for a wonderful mentor, and then to learn a domain, right? You're trying to learn a practice, a craft. And what is cool about a startup is you get to do 30% of everything, but I would actually steer away from, early in your career, the job that is just a little bit of everything, because you're not going to develop that domain experience that leads you to something else. So mentor plus the ability to pick up a craft. And then if you want a little more growth opportunity, a little more stable, kind of looking C and D, as opposed to the early days of just 10 people in a garage, has a very different feel, which I'm sure we can talk more about.
So to respond to that, I super agree with you in many ways, but I will also say that at the 10 to 18 to 10 company that I worked with, we brought on interns who they just got to do everything. And so if you don't necessarily know which domain is the one you're interested in, I think there's actually a lot of value in experiencing that for a finite period of time to figure out what you're intrigued by. And then I would actually defer to your judgment. I think that's probably the way to go.
That's a great point. The only thing to keep in mind, if it is kind of spreading you around, which you can learn from, is what you're kind of hoping for is afterwards to be able to demonstrate something, right? So a lot of the best internships manifest as a specific project, right? I'm getting fairly tactical right now, but if you can wander for 30% and deliver a project for 70%, everybody knows you were able to do blah, right? You delivered that thing, whether you're a designer and it was a great experience, whether you're an engineer and you pushed that feature, or you're a product and you delivered that feature, excuse me. I think that's the thing, is try to own enough of that full delivery so that you see all the elements of that.
I think the question on the red flags, I was just going to address it a little bit because I noticed we hadn't yet. I think the question always is like, how much money does this company have, or where is the money coming from? That's always fine to ask in an interview. In fact, that's a great thing to ask. Everyone's always going to ask it, and it is fine to just making sure you know that you can ask that. How much runway does this company have? How long are we going to do this specific thing? One of the things I'd like to look for, and looking back, what I would have wanted to see was asking about milestones. So not just what were the, not just where the money was coming from or how the money was coming in, but what was our technical goals going to be as a company, or what were our achievable milestones along the way. And if a company doesn't have milestones or goals or things that they're wanting to achieve, that's probably a red flag generally. If it's it may be well funded and they're figuring that out, or it's early phase and they're figuring that out. But typically, my experience has been without some kind of clear goals, they won't be accomplished.
To that end, I think that the transparency around sharing those goals is really important, and it comes back to often like what your personal values are. I have definitely had CEOs who don't want to talk to me about funding, and that's their prerogative as long as I've got some reasonable assurance that there is money, and we're not all gonna. One day I woke up and there was $5,000 in the WeFunder bank account, and that was not super awesome. But I think that if there is not transparency and really good communication around what the goals are in a way that allows you to actually action on them and be successful in the role, that's for me a big red flag.
I'll just echo Ryan's point that yeah, asking about where's the funding coming, where is the company funded, what's the funding plan, but also what's the plan, what's the business plan for the company, and really just ask tough questions about that. I always go back to CEO I had at the medium stage startup. He'd always, in our quarterly review meetings, he'd always like beat his hand on the table and say, the plan is the plan until there's another plan. Things change a lot, but it's good to have something documented, written down, and whoever is hiring you or interviewing you should be able to articulate that quite well. And if they don't, then obviously there's a bit of a red flag.
Could I add one more there? I think on the plan side, if you can ask them, what are different ways you could see this going, that allows you to determine, do they really understand, right, that yes, there's a plan, it may or may not work, but we have backup, right? And you'll just learn a lot more about the diversity of possibilities that you might face.
So I noticed that about half of you raised your hands indicating that you're looking for an internship, and about the other half for full-time positions. And I think that matches relatively well with what's on offer on the room next door. I'd like to ask each of the panelists then to choose to answer one of two things. Either to tell us about what compensation looks like for a full-time position at a startup company and how it might differ from a large company, especially a startup company that's got, let's say, fewer than 10 employees, as many of the ones next door do. And so equity, stock in the company might be part of that compensation. Either talk about that or talk about, please, internships. And we've touched upon that a little bit, but if you've hired people for interns before, as I know some of you have, what you were looking for and what went well with internships.
Great. I was hoping I was going to get to choose the one based on who has responded so far. I don't know if I want to, which one I want to go with.
Tell us about compensation.
Okay, compensation. All right. So depending on what the size of the startup is, so again, I'll target it more towards the sub 10. There's always, at the sub 10 time frame, you're always going to be hoping on the come, meaning your compensation is going to be more tied to the outcome of the company. So that if you're that early stage in a business, most of your compensation, I shouldn't say most, but your compensation is going to be much lower than a comparable large company. So at a large company, you're not going to get equity or anything like that. You maybe get a good bonus. You might get you'll probably get a market rate salary plus, the opportunity for bonuses. At a startup company, especially small scale, you're going to be getting under the actual cash you get paid is going to be under market rate, but combining that with your equity option should be close to market rate. So what I've seen in some small startups that I've worked with is a cash payment, and then that was about 2/3 of the market rate salary, and then 1/3 of their market rate salary was in a option pool. So it was against the kind of future value of the company at that period of time. And I think that's probably going to be where most companies are going to want you to live, because they're going to want you to be invested in the future of the business. And so you want to take as much of that equity as you can and hope that there's going to be a big outcome out of it. So it's usually, very rarely will startups be kind of paying at the high end of the spectrum. Now there are limited, if they need a very specific skill set, they might be willing to, but beyond that, it's generally going to be, significantly lower than market rate.
I will add to that, in San Francisco particularly, where it's obviously an incredibly competitive startup environment, they try to throw a lot of perks at you. You can build out your desk and it can have a giant Mac and blah, 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 and lunch and, dogs come to the office on Fridays, and whatever they can think of, I think is also really common in that environment. And if there are things that can be done to create value that are not necessarily cash compensation, that's often something you'll see at startups, which is nice, But I imagine you'd probably like me to talk about interns. Is that fair? So I've hired a number of interns at different roles, and I think that overall, what I'm generally looking for is someone who can be successful, because interns are a finite period of time, right? So I'm usually looking for someone who can be successful in a relatively short period of time, which to me comes from learning quickly, Being able to ask the right questions, and actually I apply this to any hiring in general. It's not about knowing the answer, it's about knowing you don't know the answer and raising your hand and saying, I need to think about this. Can we work through this together? Again, comfortable with ambiguity. That's just what the environment looks like. And I think being really self-driven in terms of one learning, you will almost certainly be dropped into the deep end. If you're an intern, you're probably going to get a little more support because there's an understanding that you don't have, a background in any sort of business necessarily. But generally speaking, if you can swim, that's going to go a long way. And I try to evaluate for that and assess for that in the hiring process. And I also try to be really realistic about what things are going to look like in this startup environment so that the person I'm interviewing can do a good job of assessing for themselves if it's going to be a fit.
I think Ryan and Katie summed that up pretty well. I don't have too much else to add. I think I don't have too much experience. Well, on the intern side, I'll just echo exactly what Katie said. On the compensation side, maybe I'll just say, for very small, obviously, sub 10 person startup companies. I took the leap of going from an established, multinational corporation to taking a risk at a medium stage startup, and at that time, I think there was some compensation hit to me, but there was a small amount of stock still available, but it was reasonably, that was a balance. And then when I took the next stage to go to an 8-person startup, then I took a big hit in my salary, but I knew it was for deferring the potential of what we became, and sure enough, a year or two later, we sold the company, so my equity there really helped out. And I saw that as a potential. It could have gone bust, but I think that comes with the scenario. That's all I have to say.
The only thing I would add on the comp side, and you just mentioned the success, so I know this will be the other side of it. Being in these early stage companies, like I said, you'll get more equity, less salary. But early in your career, I think you should assume that is worth nothing. So it's just so hard to pick that. I'm being completely honest with you guys, right? VCs get it wrong constantly, and you have less information than the VC, right? So I love doing this, and I would keep doing this, and I'm willing to take the pay hit. When you should look at, am I excited enough about the problem that the company's solving? Am I excited about the mentor and the opportunity for growth? That should be really, and the day-to-day, that should be really what drives it. The money will be worse, and it's totally up to you. You accept less money for different geographies and all that. I think that's really what the decision comes down to.
And along those lines, we did have a question on, can you expect medical benefits, for example, at that early stage if you're a paid employee or getting some kind of compensation?
You should be able to.
You should be able to?
Yes.
That was a yes for the microphone.
So we've got about just under 10 minutes left. So want to specifically talk through, what kind of questions should they all be asking? How can this group, as they're about to go next door and talk to some of these startups to seek out employment opportunities, how can they put the best foot forward? How can they stand out from their peers without it being like Hunger Games over there? So we want to keep it civil here. But what kinds of things can they do to really make an early impression?
So I'm going to jump to a little bit the previous question on internships just a second, because this is applicable to the standing out. If you can talk about what you were involved in and what you did on something, so if it was a project, if it's a extracurricular activity, what your specific involvement is, what part of that you owned, and that's and having understanding. So it's not necessarily just having a title in an organization of some type, but having an actual experience. That was always something that I looked for whenever I was hiring an intern or even hiring individuals, is what they actually do, and could they articulate what their experience was.
I'm not hiring anyone next door, but what I usually get excited by is somebody who can show me their excitement for the product or the company, or something that makes it that they can make a connection around what we're actually talking about and why you might want to join the company.
I think you said it best with one of the things that you're looking for is the self-learner, right? And so where you have an example from your past of where you went from zero to something, right? You knew nothing, it's a new code base, it's a new language, it's a new market, whatever it is, where you went from zero to one and how you navigated that is very compelling. That's a great thing for you to kind of lean on.
I'll add to that by saying, like, if you can tell a story well, tell a story about what you did, what was the outcome, why you did it, what was motivating you. Doesn't matter what it is. I think that is an important skill. Ask questions. Ask well-structured questions. Be curious. I think that's and you can always get a kind of a sense for the genuine curiosity of somebody and whether there's a certain lean to whether it's technical or a non-technical field. I would say don't have to try to impress that you know everything about. Most of these companies here are very, very young, okay? And they have a concept and everything, but you probably haven't heard much about them. So you don't have to go crazy and over-impress them, impress us about, I won't speak for Zach, but I would say, engage in a conversation that's inquisitive and curious, and I think that's at the root of it to me.
And I think to tag on really quick, for those of you who may not have a lot of work experience, how can you look at your experience at ASU? Have you led a project? Do you volunteer? Are you part of other organizations that you have lent some skills and developed those skills in order to apply them elsewhere? So don't be afraid to figure out how you can translate those skills that you have been acquiring, regardless of how long your work experience may or may not have been.
And we're gonna wrap up in just a minute here. These panelists, I hope, will hang around for a little while in case you would like to ask them questions that didn't get asked. But before we let them go, I think we should put one more question to them, a real doozy, and say, what superpower do you think you've developed while working at a startup company that you wouldn't have had otherwise?
You want to go?
No, go for it.
No, go for it.
Pink one. Pink two.
Oh, okay. So the pink team's gonna respond first to this. Mine is almost certainly ability to be an effective communicator and presenter. I think just going through the rigor of doing that, I think whether it's getting up in front of a crowd of several hundred people and presenting something about a product, or in a product management meeting in front of 5 angry engineers, be able to be influential in your communication skill. That's what I've learned the most. I got a lot to work on still, sure, but I know, looking back from where I started, I was pretty timid. I was coming out of school, but just going through the ringer of actually having to present and speak and influence people, that's the superpower that I learned.
That's a good one. I like that one. I'd say mine is that you can hand me something that I don't really know anything about, and I will go figure it out. When I started at WeFunder, we're a platform for crowdfunding, thus we're heavily regulated by FINRA and the SEC. Didn't know anything about any of that, and within 3 months was running most of our major projects. So just ingesting information, figuring out how it applies to other pieces of the operational universe, and sort of syncing it all together to understand what I'm looking at and what impacts what and how to deal with, whatnot, is, I think, what I've taken away.
These are both two great ones. I also want to add I almost want to use the word grit, but the ability to hit, what seems like failure or utter failure, that, this is have to find a solution, and know that the ability to go find that new solution, or know that you can go find that solution or find an answer to this problem, because it's a lot of times there's failure, or at least seemingly failure. I'll call it that. It feels like there's a failure. So in any of these in any startup company, there's always going to be huge setbacks, or at least what seems like a setback at the time. And your ability to bounce back from that and move forward, I think that's, for me, what's been the kind of biggest skill I've had to personally develop that way.
Thank you for buying the time. So I think maybe the one, it's hard to put into words, but it's something about realizing that there aren't rules saying you can't do it. So there's a certain amount of boldness you start to just realize you can do. You can get to Obama. You know, like if you really need to, for the sake of your marketing, for the sake of your fundraising, there are people that you can get to. There are audacious things that you can try just by being kind of relentless and just realizing, oh, there's not actually anything stopping me from doing that. Whether it's getting scrappy and just trying to bump into people on the T, the subway, it just, you realize that the things that you think you can't do, nobody's actually said you can't. And so challenging yourself to be a little more bold about how you achieve that goal is something I think you learn a bit over time.
Yeah, it's like not being loyal to something, the existing process. Just not being loyal to an existing process is actually one of the things I really like about startups as well. And I think that the understanding that if we've done it this way forever, cool. We don't have to do it that way anymore if we don't think that's the best way to do it any longer, which is fun.
Well, Ryan, Katie, Arno, and Cole, thank you so much for visiting with us today, of sharing your expertise and your wisdom around the startup world with us and with our students here. And with that, we want to thank you all for being here as well. We hope to continue to provide more opportunities like this for you and continue to build out opportunities for you within the startup community. So thank you.